Hello everybody and welcome to another board game discussion video. Today's topic is all about tabletop RPGs and more specifically how you as a gamer can get into tabletop RPGs if you haven't already done so, as well as some advice on how to find some new people, how to find a good group, a good game, all of that kind of stuff. Essentially, I started thinking about this because over the last few months I finally started really getting back into tabletop RPGs, finding new groups and doing all this kind of stuff, figuring out how I'm going to do it and everything along those lines. I'm super excited about it, and so I thought that this would be a good time for me to share a little bit of my own personal experiences as well as my opinionated advice for all of you. So essentially I wanted to go over a few major topics. First and foremost is tabletop RPGing right for you? Secondly, how can you find a good tabletop RPG game? Like what game is right for you? And then next up is how can you find people? How do you find people with whom to play? And last but certainly not least, how are you going to play? What are you going to do? Now, of course, this is all obviously my opinion, but based off of my own personal experiences. And so I would love to hear what you guys have to say, not only for my sake, but also for anybody who's watching and needs a little bit of help, a little bit of instruction. Please share anything and everything you got in the comments. I would love to hear it and love to have it as well. So with that, we're just going to jump right into the first topic, which is, are tabletop RPGs right for you as a gamer? So essentially, if you are already a gamer, the answer is most likely yes. The fact is that there are a lot of tabletop RPGs out there, and they run the gambit as far as what you can do, as far as theme, as far as how deep they go in terms of role-playing itself, as far as how deep they go in combat, all sorts of different things. One of the first questions that you have to ask yourself, though, is in general from any game, regardless of if it's a video game, board game, or TTRPG, you have to think, what are you trying to get out of it? Because there is most likely a TTRPG that can give that to you. Essentially, if you're looking for being able to be in character, having some kind of a narrative storyline, having fairly extensive combat or fairly light combat, having a lot of freedom in terms of what you're able to do within a game, having a ridiculous amount of table interaction, all of those things are possible within a TTRPG world. The problem is that it can be ridiculously overwhelming. So the thing is that if you are sort of used to playing like your board games and video games and stuff like that, and if you've played games like say Descent or some of these other really big games, or like on PC you play any of like the Fallout series or Elder Scrolls or things like that, and they don't really hit you very well, then maybe an RPG is not necessarily for you. The fact is that it depends a lot on the other people you're playing with and how they can interact with and between one another though. But in general, if you like games, then it's a very high likelihood that you'll be able to like a TTRPG. Even if you're not a huge fan of board games as a whole, there is probably some aspect of these RPGs that you'll be able to enjoy. That said, we're going to move right into number 2, which is, what tabletop RPG is right for you? There are dozens or hundreds and maybe thousands of systems out there for various RPGs that you can do. Certainly Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder, Shadowrun, let's see what else. I had a couple others off the top of my head that I can't remember. Vampire Masquerade, Call of Cthulhu. Those are probably some of the most popular ones that you'll hear talked about. I did a video on my personal top 5 not too long ago. But the thing is that these are all very different in how they work. They're very different in terms of the atmosphere in which the world exists. They're very different in theme in terms of you might have a high fantasy, you might have sci-fi, you might have horror, you might have, you know, any number of things. I mean, you can have something kind of goofy like Gamma World, or you can have something that's meant to be dirt simple like Roll for Shoes, or you might have something that's meant to be very universal like GURPS. So with all of that in mind, the fact is that there is probably something out there for you. My advice is, if you're looking into starting up a TTRPG, then look into Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, and Shadowrun. By extension, you could also look at, say, like Call of Cthulhu and maybe Star Wars as well. The fact is that all of those are still in print. They're all very popular. You'll be able to find a ton of resources about them, and it'll give you a good sort of general use idea of what you can see and what you can get from different tabletop RPGs. I'll also add in 7th Sea. You'll see why in a little bit. So essentially, in D&D, you have the very quintessential fantasy RPG type. You have a little bit more complexity in terms of building your character, and the fact is that the world and how the characters interact is really up to the GM, the game master, as far as how they run it. Do they allow you to really interact a lot more? Is it more combat heavy, more social heavy? You can run a lot of different stuff within D&D. Pathfinder is kind of the same. It started off as an offshoot of D&D, so you see a lot of very similar things, but mechanically they're a little bit different. Call of Cthulhu is a huge thing if you're a fan of the Cthulhu mythos, obviously, where in that you really have a survival horror type of thing. You've got your sanity meter. You do have combat, but the idea is that you're not good at combat. It takes place in, you know, the 1920s, 1930s, the same as most of the Cthulhu mythos stuff. So you have sort of that gritty film noir type of feel. So it's a little bit different. Shadowrun is a very popular sort of cyberpunk type of thing, where you can have augmentations on your character that range from bionic arms to any number of other things, various bionics of different sorts. You've got hacking, you've got folks that are known as street samurai. Those are kind of like your fighter groups. But yeah, this sort of idea of big evil corporations, like if you think of RoboCop and kind of stuff like that, but with more augmentations. That's sort of what you're seeing with Shadowrun. So again, it's a very sci-fi themed thing, very much very nitty gritty as far as the combat, very tactical and things of that nature. You also have magic associated in that as well, just like you see with a lot of the high fantasy. Moving right along, of course, Star Wars. Everybody knows Star Wars. This one is great for introducing new players to, especially if you're talking about Edge of the Empire / Age of Rebellion. In those games from Fantasy Flight, you have a much more fluid combat and role-playing system. You're not necessarily rolling a die, adding together a bunch of numbers, but rather you're just looking at successes and failures. So that's something that can really appeal to a lot of newer players, especially, particularly when you put it in the context of, this is Star Wars. I know Star Wars, I'm familiar with this. There's a lot of good information about it. The source books are really excellent. The latest ones especially have done a great job of expanding the universe and making it a lot of fun for a lot of different people. Last but not least, one of my other favorites is 7th Sea. Within 7th Sea, in my opinion, it has the best roleplay aspect of any game that I have ever seen, where you're actually rewarded for very high quality roleplay and essentially dictating, this is what my character does and this is how I do it, and you know, like wah wah wah, whatever it is that you're doing. And I love that fact. I love being able to act out things and say more precisely what my character is doing, rather than I stab the guy for 6 damage. To me, that's not nearly as interesting as, you know, talking about dodging and bobbing and weaving and moving and all that kind of stuff, not to mention talking about like performance and all of those kinds of things. So I really adore 7th Sea, and relatively recently they came out with the 2nd edition, so it's still pretty on top of stuff. But like I said, that's just a quick summary of some of my own personal favorites. But again, there are all sorts of different RPGs for all sorts of different things. You can take a look at RPG Geek. It's associated with Board Game Geek, and you can learn all about all sorts of different stuff along those lines. Moving right along though to number 3 is, how do you find people to play with? This is a huge issue that a lot of people have. And honestly, the best way to do it is one of 2 ways. Essentially, first off is find a local game store. This is really going to be your best way to go about this. If you find some local game store, whether they host Magic the Gathering, board games, or any other stuff like that, you'll be able to go in and just say, hey, like talking to the retailers, the people who run the place, do you guys do D&D nights? Like, do you do Adventure League? That's one of the big things that D&D does relatively regularly. And so at the very least, you could go and you can meet people who are interested in tabletop RPGs. Not necessarily the same ones that you're interested in, but you can at least go out and say like, hey, I'm so-and-so and I'm interested and I want to do this. I know it can be really, really difficult to do that, but by the same token, a lot of local stores will have sort of postings where it'll say, you know, like looking for group type of thing. And you can say, you know, I'm a player looking for this game, or this game, let me know. Or you can say, I want to try to DM, I want to try to GM this particular game and I'm looking for players, something like that. And it can really, really help with that type of thing. Next, and probably the most likely thing as far as finding players, is online. And there's a lot of great resources for it, including internationally. Here in the US, we have a lot of various resources we can use. We've got Meetup is one that's very, very common. You can look for TTRPG groups, and you also have things like Facebook as well as Reddit. On Reddit, you've got LFG, or Looking for Group, and that is a huge sub on Reddit where you can go and you can find people in particular locations and all sorts of other different stuff. You can also go onto the RPG Geek and you can see a bunch of forums for Looking for Group, all sorts of different things like that. In addition, you've got websites like Roll-D20, which is one of my favorites to use. On that, you can do play-by-post even, and all sorts of other stuff. You've got DMs who are constantly looking for players that you can play online with, and all of that kind of thing, which leads me right into my last point, which is, how are you going to play a TTRPG? The fact is that typically tabletop RPG sessions will last between 4 to 6 hours at minimum. Some people do it a lot longer. Others, if you're really quick and concise with it, you can shorten it a little bit. But the thing is that fundamentally you need to have a game master, you need somebody to run it, and then you need a bunch of players. So the game master tends to be the hardest person to find, but if you manage to find one as well as players, especially if you do it online, it can be really tough to figure out how you can meet. And for me at least, I love the idea of doing tabletop RPGs online. I've done it quite a bit in the past and we have found a lot of different ways to make it work. But that said, there are a bunch of tools available now, particularly looking at things like D&D Beyond, as well as Roll-D20, which is agnostic in terms of the actual system that you can run with it. And it gives you a virtual tabletop that you can put maps on and do all sorts of different stuff. And so it's as if people are sitting around a table looking at their characters, and you can run it over Skype, Google Hangouts, FaceTime, whatever you want to do. And it makes it really, really easy. That said, if you really want to meet in person, the best thing to do is go to a local game store, meet people that way, and then you can potentially meet at the game store, somebody's house, whatever happens to work for all of you. But yeah, that's pretty much the best ways that I have found to do it. And I know it's kind of like, well, you either do it online or in person, but the fact is that with all of the tools available, it has become very, very easy to find and keep a relatively reasonable, steady group of folks with tabletop RPGs. And so, like I said, I personally am super excited because I'm finally getting back into it after such a long break. I cannot wait to get started on it, but that is far more than enough rambling from me. I know you guys are probably sick of hearing from me now, but once again, I have to know what you guys have to say about this. What are your personal tips about getting into tabletop RPGs? What helped you when you first started? How did it help? What does it do? Did a friend bring you in? Did you just find something randomly? Did you find a particular game that you really excited to play? Just please let me know anything and everything in the comments below, because not only will it help me learn more about you guys, but again, if people are watching and want to learn some of this stuff, you could really help them as well. I'm going to put a few links in the description to some of the resources I mentioned so that you guys can take a look at those as well. But with that, thank you so very much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed it. As always, if you haven't done so already, please take a look at my various social media pages. On all of those, you can interact with myself and my channel in a bunch of really fun ways, including but not limited to playing games with me if you would like. So please let me know what you'd like to do on there. But that said, thank you very much for watching this. Hope that you enjoyed it. Happy gaming, and I will see you next time.